mean, what I'm always curious about with this in the Tuskegee is, how does someone do a project that is so long, spends so much effort, spends all these resources, never publishes on it, and they still get money to do it? To me, it says that there's something also that maybe should be part of an ethical analysis in the process of peer review of science. Yeah. How is it that someone can just keep doing? Forget it. We didn't have IRBs then. Right. That's one thing, but how does someone just get to do that and spend public money? I think there's an ethical argument about this expenditure of public funds for that. Absolutely, and in fact, even though there weren't IRBs at the time, what there was scientific review boards. There were scientific review boards who met and discussed the experiments and to approve the public expenditure. Now, there are questions about how much information was actually given to them and whether accurate information was given to those scientific review boards. And our documentation suggests they at least knew some parts of it, if not all parts of it. But there is a serious question about the appropriateness of the research, but also, from my perspective, the blameworthiness of the individuals who, at every level of government review, were reviewing this research and approving the research and endorsing going forward, particularly in an international context, which to me adds additional concern. Tina.
Can I follow up on that? And I just want to compliment both of you for your willingness to engage on this issue. I can tell that it's both illuminating but also personally difficult, and so I'm grateful for your service on that front. But you've said very little about Guatemala, and I wanted to just ask you to reflect a little bit on what role does Guatemala play in all this, because of course if you roll the clock forward, Guatemala is now indignant and ready to go. But once upon a time, Guatemala, which like any state under international law is viewed as being responsible for its citizens, played some role. And I want to just hear you reflect on, was it fooled into this? Was it invited into this? Was it forced into this? What's up with Guatemala?
Maybe I could answer,
please.
Begin by answering that. That's one of the subtleties that I was going to speak about that makes it a little more difficult. I was last week in Mexico City representing the Commission, speaking about this to a consortium of Pan-American, Latin American bioethics commissions. And they asked, what can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And I think that Guatemala was at fault along with the United States. The Guatemalan investigators were true partners in this research. They trained in the United States, and a number of them received fellowships to return to the United States. The nation of Guatemala benefited from this work because, as part of the infrastructure needed for these studies, a series of clinics were built in Guatemala, assisting with their entire medical system, laying the groundwork for these studies. So this was clearly a dual relationship, even though the coercion for the Guatemalans, I think, is likely.
So that's one thing I'm going to build on. I agree with everything Steve just said, except one thing that the Commission has been looking into is thinking about international research. When we are the country that has greater funds and availability of resources, and going into countries that has lesser developed medical systems and need the partnership and the funds in order to develop their own infrastructure. So it's true, Guatemala was a true partner in this process, and they not only made it possible, but without their cooperation, the study never could have gone forward. Would I put them at exactly the same level of blameworthiness? I understand the perspective of a country who also is benefiting from and allowing us to come in order to benefit their society more generally by having an investment of U.S. research funds. And that's one of the real tensions of doing international research, is thinking about the populations into which we go and whether it has a coercive effect because of the funds that we bring, or if in fact that is a sufficient benefit to the population. And so that's one of the things that we've really been talking a good bit about as we're thinking about the contemporary research standards, is what are the implications of partnering with other countries where we have greater resources? Is it a sufficient benefit? Is it coercive? How do you balance the concerns? Can you do research abroad that you couldn't legitimately do in this country? Is that a sufficient bar of ethical research, or do you recognize that other countries have different standards for the protection of their citizens, and do you adopt that country's standards for the protection of their citizens or our own?
But there's another interesting angle on that, I think. I mean, with individual subjects, we've got a concept of vulnerable populations, vulnerable subjects, people whose ability to say no we have some doubt about. If you're a Central American country in the 1940s, your ability to say no to the United States may have been somewhat limited. In fact, we fomented a coup to overthrow the popularly elected government of Guatemala about 6 years later, as I recall. On the other hand, I mean, there are concerns about paternalism and saying that some people can't make decisions. To say that some sovereign states aren't powerful enough or free enough to be allowed to make their own decisions is even harder, and would not make as many fans with said sovereign states. But there may be, it may be useful to at least think about whether we should consider vulnerable states for which some special heightened ethical scrutiny might be appropriate. Politically, I think very hard to do. Tina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Politically, very hard to do. but I know, I think
But realistic.
yeah, fundamentally, I think the fiction of international law is that every sovereign state has the same
His
status.
name is
Tino.
Looks familiar.
David?
So I thought your comment about the, even if there had been adequate consent, there's real questions about whether this research should have been done given the burden ratio and the harms that people were being exposed to. I think that's another ethical objection, and there's another strain historically in favor of thinking that that's not just a contemporary sort of IRB-based concern. Cindy Halpern in her book, Lesser Harms, talks about the history of vaccine research and how there was this very strong, admittedly paternalistic, not a lot of consent, but a strong paternalism that really revolved around the importance of protecting people who are exposed to risk, at least in the vaccine research area that she was working in, and suggested that that was actually a very strong part of the ethos that to some extent has been lost and replaced by such a strong emphasis on informed consent. And I think your sense that that's another strain of something that's really problematic about this, that the burden-benefit ratio and the protection of the participants was inadequate even by the time, seems to me to be right on target.
Yeah, and I mean, and certainly something that continues to be a contemporary issue, and one that, as we're developing the current report, we've been thinking about as well, is how do we think about, that burden-benefit ratio with respect to human research subject? Is there some research that you simply would say, under any conditions, isn't permissible?
Hi, I'm Michelle Overman. I was struck by something that Steve said in passing, and I think it's really important, and that was when you said it's important to remember how desperate this country felt. And in my work as a lawyer on IRBs, the most trouble I've had as the community representative has occurred when there's a degree of desperation on the part of the researchers to move the research forward. So in one case, working with pediatric neuroblastoma studies, so these are little kids with brain tumors, the science was really sloppy, and the desperation was so powerful that it took me to say, wait a minute, where's the control? What are you going to do, and how are you going to do this with an N of 6? And it's crazy to have the non-scientists have to say that. And the same thing is seen, I think, in contemporary stem cell studies, where there's just a sense of, on the part of the researchers, desperation to move this forward, and it's led, I believe, to some sense of urgency and some lack of caution on scientific design.
Yeah.
And so I think that when we look back on what happened in Guatemala or Tuskegee, the desperation should be part of the warning system that's put in place. The more desperate we feel, the more cautious we should be.
Yeah. I mean,
it's
I
not
think
the desperation of the patients. I mean, they're
right.
sort of these days, that's a constant desperation, right? It's the desperation of the researchers.
I mean, that's one of the things that's helpful, I think, about the context Steve provides about how prevalent the issues of STDs were at the time. But one thing that's interesting about that, because this is really an issue that we explored, is, understanding the contextual environment in which this need to really, move forward was happening. But the timing doesn't align perfectly here, right? I mean, the real problem for, wartime need to, cure STDs or provide some prophylactic measure, that need isn't really here given the timing of when a lot of this happened. And so it's true that there was that really strong sense motivating this and helps to explain somewhat what the motivations were. It's just that the time frame doesn't align quite perfectly. I think there was a Casey. Yeah.
I was going to ask, you mentioned, I think, that one of the gentlemen who did it was still alive and testified about it. I guess my first question is, was he ever prosecuted? And second, as y'all think about setting these standards, how do you sanction people who have both violated them in the past and who violated them in the future? Like, is there international law? Is it domestic law? Like, how does that actually work?
Well, the person I mentioned was a woman who was a participant not in a decision-making capacity.
Nobody has been prosecuted. Your question about deterrence is a interesting and difficult one, and one of the issues that we are dealing with on the contemporary research standards is questions about compensation and reparations. And how do you think about compensation for injuries in studies, and how do you think about reparations if appropriate? We weren't asked to do an analysis of reparations or sanctions or how to address the issues that arose from Guatemala in that sense. And so our forward-looking study is generalized. It's not meant to address whether or not reparations are due in Guatemala or whether or not compensation is due. But that's part of the questioning, whether those models can serve as effective deterrents in thinking about the protection of human research subjects going forward.
Just as a follow-up, do you think going forward it's the researcher's job to be liable for that, or do you think it's the government's job for dispersing the funds? Like, where do you think the fault lies?
I will say that is an issue that the Commission is currently deliberating about, and I think once we reach a consensus that we can talk more comfortably about that. But until then, it's an issue that we can't really discuss. Thanks.
Something you probably know more about. In the 60s and 70s, there was a tremendous incidence of bacterial meningitis in children. The worst was Haemophilus influenza, for which there's now a vaccine. And there weren't antibiotics that could cross the blood-brain barrier to cure it. And that sense of desperation was going around in this country, causing a lot of deaths and mental retardation. And I know George McCracken from Baylor, and that was sort of the center of the research, where they did what was called Rickham reservoirs, where they put a reservoir into the center of the brain, into the fluid area, and injected aminoglycosides, an antibiotic, hoping that was the only way to kill it. And my understanding, they had to stop that prematurely because there was an increased unexpected incidence of death. Then I remember I was in residency at the time,